Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. You've been in Los Angeles about 7 years now. Tell me what... Before you started writing so intensively about Los Angeles, what did this place look like to you from the distance you were at before?
You know, it's funny. I moved to Los Angeles in 2007, but I had about a year's notice I was going to be moving. We moved for my wife's job. She got one of those too good to refuse jobs. And when I was looking to move here and knew I was going to move here, I was working for a group in New York City called the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, which was a transportation advocacy and reform group in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut tri-state region. I was their New Jersey person. And so I knew I was moving. I started talking to my friends in New York and not really New Jersey as much, but New York City that were the transportation advocates so that I could get a feel for what I was going into. And what I heard was Los Angeles is a crater of bad transportation planning, and there's very little culture built around transportation as there is in New York.
This is in 2006?
This would be in, the 2006-2007 timeframe. And the irony is probably at that time, Los Angeles had one of the coolest transportation scenes going with its Midnight Riders group, which was literally a group of cyclists that met once a month, not critical mass, but once a month or weekly or more often on some sort of themed bike ride and traveled around the city. And the rides went from 12 people to several thousand people very quickly. And if you look at the old pictures from Midnight Riders, it's very interesting because they're like playing in downtown Los Angeles, and downtown Los Angeles is a ghost town at night. They're like on the fountains, hugging statues, playing in like big empty parks and it was, that doesn't happen. Like downtown LA is a normal city right now. And that's a compliment from where it wasn't, a decade ago.
Right.
But,
from everywhere from the mid-1950s to the mid-2000s. After the mid-2000s, it was sort of a ghost town at night anyway.
Yeah. But it's really striking to see some of those pictures. And so Midnight Riders was, as I said, probably one of the coolest things going in sort of the alternative transportation scene. But outside of LA, no one really knew what it was. If you knew LA, 95% chance you knew it as the car culture capital of the world. You knew it from Steve Martin movies where you get in your car to drive to your mailbox at the end of the driveway. If you were sort of into the transportation scene, you may have heard of the transportation advocacy / social justice group, the Bus Riders Union, which had actually successfully sued the MTA at the time into changing the way it did its funding strategies to really beef up its bus network and focus on lower income communities. And that's something that's really kind of a landmark case and kind of an outlier in cities around the country. I think when the MTA signed the consent decree, 'cause it was never fully litigated. I don't think they realized exactly what they were signing, to be honest, because they basically then spent the next 10 years trying to nibble around it. And as soon as they were out of it, they started pushing transportation taxes to increase there is some funding set aside for buses, there's some funding set aside for highways, but really the goal of these taxes is to build up our rail network. Finally, build up the LA rail network. Yes. So when I came to LA, I sort of thought this was a place with no transportation culture. There was nothing really exciting going on, nothing groundbreaking. And we actually were thinking, not knowing everything, that Streetsblog LA, as New York City was taking off under the leadership of Jeanette Sadik-Khan, we thought that LA, which was the second Streetsblog except for New York, was going to be sort of the other story. And what we ended up covering instead over the first 6.5 years, instead of it being the other side of the story, the bad side, we ended up covering the turning point, which was really exciting for us. And some people credit us for being about the turning point, but I think we're part of it, definitely. But we're not. So many people were involved in this and laid the groundworks for decades or got really involved. And I think it's something of an interesting story.
It is an interesting story that's happened here in Los Angeles, and I'm sitting, by the way, in Los Angeles, specifically in Mar Vista, here on Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down today with Damien Newton, the editor of Streetsblog Los Angeles, a hub of information about, what's the official wording? It's sustainable community, sustainable transportation and livable communities, right? Sustainable transportation, that means what? Bikes, it means trains, it means buses. What does it mean?
Well, every streets blog sort of has a way they look at it a little differently, what the main mission is, depending on the culture. And what we've been saying in LA is we want to create a menu of transportation options so that people feel they have a choice. Part of that is because the culture out here, when it comes to transportation, you hear a lot of, you're trying to force me to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C. And
who is you? You're trying to force me.
You is everybody that's trying to think of something besides cars in some cases. And what we're not trying to force people out of cars, what we're trying to do, we believe, and this has been shown around the world, that if you give people options on transportation choices, they're going to take different options. A guy named Gary Toth, who worked at the New Jersey Department of Transportation when they were doing some really interesting work around the turn of the century, who now works for a group called Project for Public Spaces, was he used to go around New Jersey telling people that if, your average household takes 11 trips a day, if, you're a nuclear family, if you can go from 11 trips in a car to 9 trips in a car, local traffic, not highway traffic, but local traffic congestion would basically all but disappear.
I'm just trying to think of the 11 trips in a day. It seems implausible to me, but I mean, I guess you're the one between the two of us who lives in a household with a family. Does that sound right? 11 trips of any kind?
Well, I mean, part of it is my wife and I both work from home, so it's going to be a little lower for us and for other people. But you take a trip to work, a trip from work. So there's 2. A trip to drop your kids off at school, a trip to pick your kids up from school, and dropping off and then coming back is 2 more trips. So when you look at it that way, all of a sudden it starts adding up. Trips to the store, trips to soccer practice, trips to yoga, trips to surf class.
For more gas if you're driving all these places.
Right. Trips for more gas if you're driving to all these places. All that stuff starts to add up. And so again, we're talking, your nuclear family with 1.5 kids and a dog and all that sort of stuff in this sort of calculation. I've never seen a study like that for LA that reduces the trips, but it's compelling when you think about it, because we build our transportation network to fight car congestion in most cases, we being, 90% of the world. But really, car congestion exists for 3 hours a day. And so are we building a network then that also encourages more cars the other 21 hours a day and also more congestion? And if we build a network with, wide sidewalks that have proper shading and good crosswalks, and has not a bike lane on every street, but a bike lane network where you can get from one part of the city to the other safely and attractively. A bike and pedestrian network that allows you to walk or bike easily to major bus stops and transit stations, and a transit network that reaches out into the corner of the cities but connects. It would sound like right now, if I wanted to get from Pasadena, which is without traffic a 25-minute car drive from my house, I would take the bus to the bus to the train to the train to the train.
Oh, jeez.
And even if I can take that from bus to the train, or even bus to the train, so to speak, that's going to be a big change. And they're working on that. They're working on a connecting system in downtown Los Angeles, which is going to tie all of the rail lines that we have and the ones that we're building together. And
when the Expo line is finished here, will you be able to walk to a station and go to Pasadena with a minimum of hassle, or what's that going to be like for you?
Well, it sort of depends how the regional connector ends up playing out. What they're saying right now is the regional connector in the downtown Los Angeles, I'm still going to have to transfer. But the way they're building the tracks, I'm not 100% sure that that's how it's going to be 20 years from now. It might be a little more convenient than that. And honestly, I'm one of the people that picked where they were going to live and raise their kids. One of the things we considered was where the Expo line was going to be.
Right,
and I'm not an outlier when it comes to that. There was a study done by USC that actually showed that along the quarter mile from the completed part of the Expo line, the Expo line's incidentally for your listeners, is a rail line that right now connects downtown LA to Culver City, which is about halfway to the beach. And we're building the other half now. And the reason
Very visibly too. The stations are getting there I'm surprised it's going to take as long as it is, given how much you can see.
Well, this is unofficial. I'm speculating when I say this, but there was a lawsuit against the crossings of the Expo line saying that they were going to create more traffic. The judge did not issue a stay, and this is pure speculation, but I think they built all those crossings first so that if they lost this, again, I have no inside knowledge here, but my guess is that if they lost the lawsuit, what are they going to do? Tell them to take all the crossings down? Unlikely. So I think that may have been insurance. So the most visible areas were the areas that were built first. Could be a coincidence. Could be that that's a rail construction strategy that I don't know. But I have a sneaky suspicion that there may have been more there. And, with the Expo line, they're also building a bike path in West LA, through West LA from Culver City to Santa Monica, which for people that don't know LA's geography is going to be about a 5-mile bike path, from about the halfway to the downtown LA to downtown Santa Monica the rest of the way. And there's bike lanes that connect now. And so when we talk about building a multimodal network, that's going to be key because I'm going to be about 3/4 of a mile from an expo station, which is perfect biking distance, but maybe not so perfect walking distance, especially if I'm thinking of my son 10 years from now with a bag full of books. Of course, he's not going to have books. He's going to have an iPad that's going to have everything loaded onto it. But
iPad will seem old.
That's true. He'll have a chip built into his hand or something. But I didn't know that 4 years ago. I was still thinking books when we bought the house. So, the difference between him being able to safely and conveniently ride his bicycle to the train station and take it to wherever his school is, if it's not local. And literally he'll be able to take it to downtown LA or Pasadena or Long Beach or wherever, really changes not only the way that we thought about transportation when we were building, but how we thought about education. We like our local schools, but we don't know if our kid's going to be a musical genius or a soccer star or just a normal kid that wants to go to a high school. And so, but having that expo line there opens all that up for us. And we thought that way because we're both transportation people.
Yes.
But not everybody does. But it's going to have that same impact for everyone in my community, whether they knew it or not. And this is a community that's full of young kids right now.
If we talk about the changes in the way people are getting around Los Angeles, yes, it would seem that not everybody is thinking exactly the way you did for choosing your house, but many are thinking in ways like it. It's a bit of a twofold process, isn't it? There's one of the folds here is the building of the transit network, the biking network. The other one is not just people already in Los Angeles moving to its stations, moving to the convenient spots in those networks, but newcomers moving there as well. I moved here in 2011 myself, and it was not a negotiable thing. I wanted to be near a train station, specifically on the subway. That seems to be an even more powerful force, isn't it? The way that newcomers choose where to live based on where the connections are, right?
Yeah, and you're seeing more of that. The city of Los Angeles was a little slow to embrace real transit-oriented development around its rail stations going in. Like you definitely.
Why? That seems like yeah, of course everybody wants that. That's profitable. That's convenient.
Well, I don't know why they didn't, but I know that they're on it now, but they're a little behind in the game. They have the rail stations built, and now they're like, we're going to build an affordable housing complex here and another complex here and a gigantic, beautiful hotel right here in Hollywood. And I think it's great that they're doing that, but at the same time, what we're seeing in the other cities, the smaller cities, Culver City is like almost literally completely surrounded by Los Angeles, but they had their transit-oriented development plan in place before the rail was being built. In Santa Monica, there's some political battles going on right now between an older population that's worried that dense development's going to bring a flood of traffic and a younger population that wants to live in Santa Monica.
Right. Partially because they already work in Santa Monica and want to not be on the freeway going to Santa Monica every day.
That's part of it too. And as much as I hate to say something nice about Santa Monica that sounds like I'm dissing my own community of Mar Vista, Santa Monica is basically a paradise. It's got the weather is perfect almost every day, and you have access to the beach, and you've got wonderful places to eat and be outside, and lots of park space.
Right.
99.9% of the world would love to live in Santa Monica. And I find it funny when the people there are complaining about soul-crushing traffic.
Soul-crushing traffic. I wonder, this is some point of curiosity that's come up a lot for me recently with no real answers. Maybe you have a guess, but, Santa Monica is its own city. It's got its own rules, its own type of population that gets in the way of connecting it, even though it's getting the Expo line, it's getting more and more of these connections. But why hasn't Venice been more prioritized in that way? It seems like Venice would be an easier place to hook up with the rest of Los Angeles, given that it's legally part of Los Angeles, given that there's probably fewer homeowners there. You know what I mean?
Well, I sort of understand what you're saying there, but Santa Monica is, the People's Republic of Santa Monica. By reputation, it's one of the most progressive places in America, and there's a lot of progressive people there, and I think it's been well served by its current mayor. It's a rotating mayor system, so every year they get a new mayor, and it's one of the city council members, but the current mayor there, Pam O'Connor, is, she served on the Metro Board representing the West Side cities, which is basically everything west of the 405 that is not part of Los Angeles. So Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, Culver City, Malibu, some of the other beach cities. She's represented them on the Metro Board of Directors for years. She's the current chair of the Expo Construction Authority. And she's sort of ridiculously progressive on transportation issues. She's nearly car-free, I'm told. I thought it was car-free, but I'm told she's gotten one in recent years, but it's a beater, and she only drives it occasionally.
There's a lot of this sort of kind of car-freeness in Los Angeles. It's like people who say, I'm basically a vegetarian, but I'll have chicken every other Friday, and I'll have, eggs.
Catholicism.
Yes, exactly.
And honestly, that's me. We have a car, my wife and I. We have one car for the four of us, and it probably gets out once or twice a week. And for us, the decision to have a car really came down to there's no car share in West LA that's worth speaking of at this point. And also having kids, and the LA traffic system, like if I had a sick kid, am I really going to bike from here to Cedar Sinai in Beverly Hills with a bucket bike with a kid strapped in the front?
Right.
No. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm just not.
So what's the difference between here and then cities where people can say, fine, I don't need a car, period?
I think part of it has to do that our network's not built out enough yet. And even where we have decent bike lanes in an area like this, for example, for me to get from here to Beverly Hills on a bicycle, I do it by myself. Mm-hmm. If I ever have to go to Beverly Hills or through Beverly Hills for a meeting, no problem. But the thought of doing it, I mean, literally our decision was made for the weird emergency state, condition. My kid it's bike to school day internationally today. It's May 7th, International Bike to School Day. So my 4-year-old biked to school today and I walk next to him. And on days where he doesn't bike, we either walk or I do have the cargo front loading bike and he and his sister will get strapped into the front and we'll bike up. I mean, we avoid, and I know lots of people that say this sort of thing, or I was car free till I had kids is something I hear from people a lot too. And I think it's that when we talk about options, remember at the start of the interview, I said the goal is to give people options so that they can feel comfortable not always taking their car or reducing their car ownership if they've got 2 for 2 people or whatever it is. We don't feel comfortable making that choice. And I think it's a safety issue. It's a perception issue. I would have to to get to Beverly Hills I'd at least have to ride on Pico or Olympic for a while. I'd have to ride on National Boulevard to connect because in addition to the large car sewers, as some people call them, which are the streets designed just to flush cars through as fast as possible. In addition to that, we also have networks, local networks, where I can't get from my neighborhood to another neighborhood without getting in the sewer, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Right. I'm well familiar with biking on those type of streets. I know what you mean.
And with the 405 and the 10 in my community, like basically making half a square, like to get anywhere east, I've got to cross under them. Right. And to do that, I have to be on a major street because they did not build any local connectors in these areas. So that's just my reality. And said if it were the emergency situation, that would be too many things for me to worry about while I was bicycling and feel comfortable. So we have a car.
I've read you explain in another interview elsewhere that when the city first put in, say, 20 miles of bike infrastructure, that's good in one sense, but it also wasn't connected up into a single network. Network is the word you've been using here. And I wonder, this is the same objection I've heard to many an improvement effort in Los Angeles. The city will do something, but it will be in scattered bits and pieces. And why does Los Angeles have such a hard time hooking things up to each other? Why is that always the stumbling block?
Well, first off, I think LA is doing a better job than it was doing when it first passed its bicycle plan. I mean, there was some weird politics involved to get the bicycle plan passed. And we ended up being very happy with the plan that was passed as an advocacy community, but we weren't happy until the last iteration. And there was like a last minute lobbying effort at city planning. The city council transportation committee chair literally hadn't ridden a bike in 40 years before we as Streetsblog actually gave him a lesson and filmed it for a mini film.
Oh yes, I did hear about that now that I remember, yes.
But he had become a true believer because of a really high profile horrific bike crash in his district. This was like a guy who was really like West Side liberal into social justice, and once he got there was a social justice issue in transportation, he grabbed it and embraced it. He was transportation committee chair for 4 years, and during those 4 years, we got a lot done. And part of the positive there, his chief of staff was a true believer before he was, and now he's the city council member for the area, which happens to be the area I live in, and the transportation committee chair, and he's on the Metro board of directors, and he's the vice chair of the Expo Construction Authority.
Stars align.
And he's very progressive and gets it in a way that I don't think his predecessor could, because he was not a bike guy, didn't ride transit often. He started to later in his towards the end of his career, because he actually got a rapid bus line put in on Venice Boulevard, which was a priority for him. And once he had that, he would walk to the bus occasionally and take it. But his predecessor, his old chief of staff, is like he's on that bus all the time. And he bikes, like, you know, and he was at Ciclovia before he was an elected official, like bicycling around the city. And, you know, oh, I missed that one because I was out raising money for cancer and at a bike ride. And it's like, all right, Mike, we get it. You're progressive. So that helped a lot. Like, but we didn't have, Bill Rosendahl, who was the previous chair I mentioned, his predecessor was Wendy Gruhl, and she started to get the bike stuff and there was a political benefit to the bike stuff and a social justice, and it was good policy. This all started to come together for her towards the end of her run at city council. And then Bill picked up the ball and really ran with it. Now Mike, so what we're seeing is a progression. And I'm not meaning to say that Mike's definitely better than Wendy was, but, you know, Wendy got it started. And we also had the mayor becoming, Mayor Villaraigosa, our old mayor who was just termed out last year, suddenly became like the progressive transportation mayor in the world, in the country, which was a big surprise for everyone when it happened. But the reason I'm saying all of this is, so when the city decided in 2010 it was suddenly going to become a bike-friendly city, its first efforts were a little haphazard. And what I was referring to in the interview you mentioned was we went to bed on Friday night and woke up on Monday morning. Obviously, we were awake sometime in between also, but the city had just dropped down 20 miles of sharrows. Sharrows are the like chevron markings, and they're designed to both be a reminder to drivers that bicycles have a right to the street, and bicyclists are supposed to bike right through the middle of the chevron to be positioned for maximum visibility for cyclists and out of the dreaded door zone, which is the zone where if a door opens, you'll run into it. On a car, that is.
Every cyclist's most common fear, it seems. At least it's my most common fear when I'm riding around.
And I had a weird dooring incident recently on my own, but that's neither here nor there at the moment. So it was a weird position for us organizationally as a journalism organization and an advocacy organization when this happened, because we didn't want to say, you know, what are you doing? 20 miles of weird sharrows. And because they were trying, and for years they hadn't even really been trying. So we wanted to have something nice, but at the same time it was like, you know,
come on,
what are some of these streets? You know, these are some weird places for them to be. And that was sort of how we ended up doing it. We sort of covered both sides of it and had some of the, you know, people say good things. We're so happy you're doing this and these streets are going to benefit, but this isn't the high priority areas. And said we've seen the city make real efforts to try and build a connected bike lane and bike network. And we'll hear all the time, especially in some parts of East LA, Northeast LA, and the San Fernando Valley of, this is just a half mile of bike lane in the middle of nowhere. What are they doing when they put it in? But when you pull out the map, but next year that half mile lane is going to connect to a mile lane on its eastern border. And 3 years from now, it's going to connect to, and I sort of wish they would just build it all and just be done with it. Like, let's put $20 million and build our bike lane network and be done with it. And then we'll worry about protected bike lanes and all that sort of stuff. Protected bike lanes are awesome. Yeah. But I understand what they're doing, and, you know, they're slowly building out a network and trying to retrofit the streets. And it's not a ideal situation, but I think they're giving it a genuine try, and good luck. And we're going to help as much as we can and criticize if we think they're going off track. But and sometimes we do, especially now. You referenced that I'm the editor of Streetsblog Los Angeles, but recently we had a head writer come in and sort of take over the day-to-day writing of Streetsblog, and was the founder of the Los Angeles County Bike Coalition, the first executive director of Seek La Via. So he brings a slightly more critical eye on bike stuff than I did.
I was just in Copenhagen, listeners know, a few months ago recording interviews, and cycling around there made me realize that I had a question, or that I had a question I didn't realize I had, which was, why in America do we consider lines on the ground to be bike lanes?
A lot of places in the world consider lines on the ground to be bike lanes. Yes. It's not just America. And
I don't live in those places.
But I don't have a great answer for you other than, America built a lot of its road network in the past 150 years, not the past 1,000 years. And so the spaces weren't necessarily always designed correctly to fit all the things we want to fit. And bike lanes are sort of the second level of this is what we can do. Sharrows being like the complete, like, we're not going to really do much, but here's some sharrows. Right. Bike lanes are sort of the second one where you have a designated space. What we've seen both in LA and across the world is if you have a physical buffer of some sort, it's what's going to encourage people to ride. Even if the physical buffer is just extra space. We had that on Spring and Main Streets in downtown Los Angeles. They put in these little buffers, literally just extra paint, like with a space between two sets of lines, adding a couple extra feet. And the bicycling in those lanes grew by 230% in a year, like big numbers, noticeable numbers. And that's not including the people that skateboard in those lanes, which in downtown LA is more than you would think. Right. But, so that was, and those numbers sort of hold out anywhere you look at them. And, just in the past week, the political disputes around what would be LA's first really protected bike lanes or bikeways or cycle tracks or whatever people want to call it was finally approved for the city of Los Angeles. We have some in Long Beach. We have some in Temple City, of all places. A small city, just got the bug and did it. But these would be the first ones in the city of LA proper, and construction is going to start in January of next year. Hilariously, the city decided to put its first protected bikeways on the same street as the AAA's headquarters for Southern California, which is funny.
Some sort of statement?
They claim it wasn't, but the first time I was looking at the map, I was like, that's weird. So that's definitely something that we, I don't know, maybe enjoyed a little bit.
You mentioned Long Beach, and Long Beach has been ranking high in the sort of where is good to cycle in America type surveys, where is bicycle friendly. Long Beach always comes up, and it gets talked about as a bit of the New Jersey of Los Angeles. You mentioned your experience in Jersey, which is why I bring up that comparison that I've heard. But what does Long Beach get right, and why does it get things right?
Well, the first thing I would say, both New Jersey and Long Beach are underrated. But Long Beach is a very interesting city. We opened a website down there. We actually reopened an old advocacy website under a new format called Long Beach Eyes, IZE. Although the play on words of the eyes watching Long Beach was something that I liked. And the idea, it's based on a series of websites that have eyes from around the world after Copenhagen Eyes.
Right. Michael Koval-Anderson from Copenhagen Eyes was on the show back during the Copenhagen interviews. So listeners, follow this up with him, or maybe you are following him up with this. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. That's a great site. And Long Beach Eyes was run by some college kids in 2010 and 11. It sort of went defunct. And when we were looking to do something in Long Beach, we didn't have the funding to do something like a Streetsblog. So we did, when I say Streetsblog, I mean several stories a day. So what we did is we reinvigorated Long Beach Eyes, and I've learned a lot about the city since then.
So why is it so bike friendly?
Oh, there was a question I was supposed to answer. But what they've done is interesting in that they basically went for one example of the most progressive type of bicycle infrastructure they could find and put in examples in communities that wanted them first. And the knock on this, of course, is, wow, you're building great infrastructure in the rich white communities. How progressive of you. And what they told us, I did a series on them as part of a Annenberg Journalism Fellowship in 2011. And what they told me then was, this is phase one to show it can work. If you go to a low-income community and say, we're going to take away a traffic lane and put in protected bike lanes, they're going to say, what are you doing to our streets? Why are you doing this here? Why don't you experiment somewhere else first? You always do this stuff here first.
No win.
Which is, and to be fair, and generally in low-income communities that have been treated poorly by governments, there's a reason to be suspicious. So Long Beach said, we're going to do it in the progressive areas first. We're going to show that it works in these areas, and then we're going to go into the low-income communities. When they told me this in 2011, I was a little skeptical. It sounded like a cop-out. But what we're seeing now is they have the funding, and they're doing the community meetings in these areas to lay the groundwork. And I think if this works, it's going to create a model. And, and Long Beach became the model for what we're trying to do progressively in other cities around the region. Santa Monica's done a lot of that too. And so it's these two mid-size or small and mid-sized cities, depending what numbers you want to use, 92,000 in Santa Monica, 450,000 in Long Beach, have become the people that are out in front on bicycle issues and transportation issues in the region, and the rest of us are catching up. And they have protected bike lanes in Santa Monica, in Long Beach. What they did though was they built in lanes in a way that made sense too. The protected bike lanes on 3rd Street and Broadway, one runs east, one runs west, and they put in bike signals. They put in all the top level infrastructure. You could, by bike signals, I mean that bikes get their own turn signal. Which creates a safer way to turn. It sounds obvious to say, but on those streets, they didn't say no cars, and cars can move along them just fine. I've driven on them. I drove on them and biked on them so that I would get the feel for both as I was writing about them. But those streets, they definitely made really great. They went out and did a full bike boulevard, and that means making a street that is a primarily car street that bikes can ride on also, to a street that's primarily built for bikes that cars can drive on also. And that means instead of, 4-way stops and intersections, you put in traffic circles, which has a natural slowing down effect. When you do this sort of thing, you usually also build up the pedestrian network, because a built-up pedestrian and bike network has a natural traffic calming effect. You don't need to put in a speed bump if you have narrow car lanes and wide bike lanes, so to speak. And so there was a lot of that sort of infrastructure put in, where they were putting in, by American standards, the gold star networks to create the templates to then move to the other parts of the city. And what we've seen in Long Beach is, surprise, more people bicycling in areas. The recent report by the League of American Cyclists that was ranking the cities, and I'm not a big fan of ranking stories, but that was ranking American cities for bicycle friendliness, put Long Beach at 3rd. 2 years ago, they were 34th. 4 years ago, they weren't on the list.
It's quite a jump, both years.
Yeah, and they've done and I feel like not knowing every city in America, I can't be like, well, yes, they're definitely more progressive than Portland. I've never been to Portland, so I can't say that. But I know that they've been working really hard on it. Now, there were some weird things in the American League of American Cyclists report, like it's all based on information they can gather without, literally calling every city in America. Like it talked about a bike share system for Long Beach that had been scheduled to be put in last year but hasn't been put in yet. And so we did have a little fun with that. We want to see where these bike stations are that they're talking about. Yes. But overall, what they're doing down there is really exciting, and everyone's in the regions. I think actually they may have spurred Santa Monica to pick up their game again in the bike friendly race, because Santa Monica's done some really exciting things recently too. And it's all about just creating the space to give people options and putting in education. If you can put in educational infrastructure, that sort of thing matters a lot too.
There's that competition, the value of the competition between, say, a Long Beach and a Santa Monica. But how do you get other cities, other parts of the cities to want to be in that competition in the first place?
We've definitely played up the Santa Monica Long Beach. I don't even know if it's a real rivalry. We pretend it's a rivalry on Streetsblog. Yes. But there's other things that have been done. Next week's Bike Week at LA County, the best Bike Week program that's put together, better than the MTA's countywide one, better than the city of Los Angeles, is better than Long Beach's with 450,000 people, is Pasadena's. Pasadena's had a Bike Week event every day of Bike Week for 8 years. And it's because 8 years ago, they found a nonprofit that was super interested in this and basically said, do this for us. And every year it's got better. The nonprofit Cyclists Inciting Change Through Live Exchange, which spells cycle with an I instead of a Y, which they insist is a coincidence. Because, Cyclists Inciting Change Through Live Exchange just rolls off the tongue. They've been doing it for 8 years, and every year it gets a little better, and they do films, and the films aren't like, hey, let's do E.T. because they ride bikes in E.T. Like, they're real films about urban planning that aren't boring. They do bike rides. The mayor comes out for one of the bike rides. One year they even did like a mini, they didn't call it critical mass like they do in some cities, but it was a critical mass on Saturday morning that went right to the bike fair. And so, Pasadena generally isn't put on the list of the super bike friendly cities of LA County. They're fine. There's nothing, they don't do anything wrong. They've got some great streets. They've got on the local streets, it's safe to bike regardless of whether or not there's sharrows or bike lanes. But, it's something we see. Other cities are doing interesting things based on their needs. El Monte, they don't have like a bike friendly super system set out. But one of the things they do that's super interesting is the city sponsors its own walking club, through a public health thing. And on a day-to-day basis, they do little mini walks in different places. And sometimes they're goofy, like, walk around the track for 2 miles for public health. And then, sometimes they're more involved. But it's not something you would think of when you talk about like, super progressive planning in Long Beach and Santa Monica, but for their needs, they're getting people to think about walking, and they have little mini competitions. And if you come out a certain number of days in a row, you get a t-shirt, or a certain number of days in a row, you get a pedometer. Right. And so it's, and some of the people, they keep track of their time versus other people, and you can be as involved or not as involved as you want. But a city-sponsored walking club, and it makes a difference, and it meets their needs probably better than protected bike lanes would, at least at this point. We'd like to see them do the protected bike lanes and all that too, but she really wants to see the protected bike lanes. But, each city's got to come up with ways their own, and there's interesting things that go on, whether you're doing the green sharrowed lane, only one of its kind in Belmont Shore. Well, I don't know if that's the community they're doing it in, a nice part of Long Beach, or whether you're doing the walking club or just trying to hit a home run on Bike Week every year or what. Different cities are doing different things, and there's different things each of them do really well.
Now, there's that complaint you mentioned that one hears in Los Angeles, you're trying to force us out of our cars. But there's also the complaint you hear even more, like, why does the city make us drive so much? Whenever you hear somebody complain about Los Angeles, outside of Los Angeles, they always say, oh, it's the driving. Often in Los Angeles, too, they say, I can't stand it here. There's so much driving. Why are there both of those complaints? Why is there the complaint that you're trying to force us not to drive, and this place forces us to drive? Why are they both made complaints?
Part of the way people talk about transportation when they are pretty much driving for the majority of their transportation time or trips is based around the car. I thought it was funny and sad when we were talking about the West Side Subway or the Expo line that people talk about it in. How many cars are we going to take off the street? Oh, there's still going to be congestion on Wilshire Boulevard even after the subway is built. And I was on a radio show on one of the local NPR stations, Progressive Person, and they hit me with that as though it was, in a question, as though it were the silver bullet. And I said, well, how much congestion are the 500,000 people that commute on that rail line going to feel? Yeah. Like, you shouldn't build alternative transportation to the car based on how it's going to impact the car. Right. Based on how it's going to impact the people. The same thing, the bus only lanes on Wilshire Boulevard was this huge debate in parts of the West Side. And one community in Westwood actually got the bus only lane not put in there. Right. So it's a bus only lane from downtown LA to the border of Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills and Santa Monica weren't part of the federal grant. It's not a knock on them that there's no bus lane there. I suspect they might not have been part of it if they were offered, but we don't know, so I'm not going to badmouth them. Right. But then after Beverly Hills, there's another chunk of the city of LA that doesn't have a bus-only lane, and then it reappears up to the border with Santa Monica for like another mile and a half.
A good example of the fragmented, not connected type of project we've been talking about earlier.
But here's the kicker to this story. If you look at the numbers of people, more people will ride in that bus-only lane than the 2 lanes of car traffic next to it. Right. So, yes, it's going to create 60 more seconds of delay for people in their cars. but it's going to save like 8 minutes of delay for the twice as many people that are riding the bus. And so it's, when you talk, and that's part of the problem. People talk about cars as though that's how we make the decision instead of people. And we're seeing a shift in that. And you can actually almost see a clear generational shift between people that are Gen X to people that are Gen Y to people that are millennials, between those three groups, and then everybody before them. Right. It's most dramatic. I just saw a survey in Santa Monica where when we're just talking about development, and you look at the number of people that either think the city's moving in the right direction or staying the same. 18 to 24, it's like 89%. 25 to 34, it's like somewhere in the 80s. 35 to 44, it's somewhere in the 80s. 45, it's in the 50s.
Oh, my.
55, it's in the 40s. And it just continues to go down. But it's like...
What happens at 45? What's the difference between those people and the ones younger than them, other than age?
I don't think it's just age. I think it's culture. I'm a Generation X. I'm 36. But we're the generation that grew up riding in our parents' cars everywhere. Our parents were the ones that walked 8 miles both ways to school uphill in the snow. And we're the ones that then were driven to school so we didn't have to do that. And what we're doing is, man, we don't want to spend that much time in our car. We just don't. No knock on our parents. They did what they thought was best. And in some ways, I'm certainly not going to knock my mom for driving me in that air-conditioned car every day. But we don't necessarily want to do that same thing. So much time in that car. And, we recognize that there's health reasons. And I suspect we're moving towards like a really multimodal system and an embrace of that. And that's what the studies show. Less people are getting driver's license at 16. Some people are actually looking at the decline of car licenses in people that are, just turning 16 or just turning 18 or 17, whatever state it is. People aren't running out and getting their licenses, some sort of sign that the younger generations aren't as motivated. But it's really a sign that people just aren't as interested in jumping into the car right away. Right. And part of that is bikes are cool. Sure. They're so much cooler than they were when I was a kid. Man, that orange single speed bike that I rode around from age 5 till 12, that thing is not nearly as cool as some of the things these kids have.
They've come a long way.
Yeah, and so I think the internet's helped not just in opening up new markets, but also opening up people's eyes to the options that are out there. I mean, I'm not just saying that as someone, I run blogs for a living. But that free exchange of information and knowing, there's this city in Europe where all these people ride the bike versus seeing videos of it, is striking. I think on all the Streets blogs and Streets media, the most important thing that was ever done was in 2000 and I think it was 6 or 7, one of the first street films they did out of New York, which were Clarence Eckerson, a guy who had done television for Comedy Central, filming, producing, not The Daily Show, as people always ask me right away. Was it The Daily Show? No, not they have other shows. Nice. But he and the guy that wrote the first Streets blog editor, Aaron Nappersteck, and Clarence, and a woman who worked for the transportation reform supergroup Transportation Alternatives, all went to Bogota for Ciclovia. Yes. The original open street car free event they do once a week. They close all the major thoroughfares into downtown, and it's just a gigantic, big as you could imagine street party. Dwarfs what Ciclovia is, which is probably the largest one in North America, which was a surprise for everyone when it became as big as it did, including us. But they went to that. They filmed it. They filmed the people doing the activities, bicycling, yoga in the streets, dance classes in the parks. They filmed all that stuff. And I think that film has probably been viewed in America by planners probably more times than maybe, I don't know. I don't want to say this because we've had some pretty big successes, but more times than, let's say, our top 5 other things put together. And it's had a huge impact. I think.
What do you think they've been seeing in it that just makes them share it immediately and be like, look at this?
I think it's the people. And I think it's the street is a different place. It's not a parade. It's not a.
Right.
In 2000,
there's no floats slowly moving down the street.
There's no floats. It's not a marathon where you have to pay and be in super shape to get into it. Sure. It's just a gigantic, it started as, let's put up a bunch of bollards and see what happens, to just this gigantic festival. Excuse me. And Bogota's known throughout the world for this thing now, even though other cities have their versions of it, and other cities have done some really creative things. They used, And during a really hot spell in New York one year, they took empty shipping containers they were going to get rid of and just filled them with water and chemicals to make sure it was safe and put them up around the city during their Open Streets Festival. And yeah, people swam in them. Or people would just get in and dunk their head into it to cool down while they were biking around, you know. So, I mean, we've seen it's like a mixture of thinking about things in a new way and a mixture of the creativity that was there. I think the sort of the unofficial spokesperson for it, Enrique Peñalosa, who was the transportation commissioner when they first did it, talking about how when they first advertised it, they couldn't get anyone to sign up to be part of the city team that managed it. Yeah. When they were like, come, you know, do the cycle, blah, blah, blah. And so they changed it from, they used the Baywatch logo and called it Bike Watch in English.
Bike Watch.
And the shirts were red with yellow splatter and all that, like the old Baywatch things. And they got like 1,500 people to apply for it. Oh. And I think it's the kind of creativity of saying, hey, no, this stuff's cool. You know, with Ciclavia, the LA one. Right. This is a story I tell people, which other people sometimes deny happened. But at the start of Ciclavia, the first one on October 10th, 2010, 10-10-10, I started a day. We ran a small feeder ride from the west side to the Bicycle Kitchen in East Hollywood, which was the city's first bike co-op and sort of one of the unofficial hubs of Los Angeles bike culture. And I was there, and a lot of the big bike advocates, the guy I mentioned earlier, Joe, who wasn't yet working for Ciclavia, but, you know, was a big person in the scene, founder of the Bike Coalition, and, you know, the lawyers, some of the lawyers that helped fund us and helped fund the Bike Coalition were there, and the Bike Coalition advocates were there, and, you know, the people that founded the co-op were there, and the bike advocates before there was an organized group were there. Like, we were all there, and the energy was, what if this doesn't work? What, you know, one person said to me, my nightmare is that tomorrow morning there's going to be a picture of a gigantic empty street, and then in the background you see like just a pile up of cars that are trying to cross and can't, because like we'll never get any bike infrastructure again. And like 2 minutes into the ride, you could actually feel everyone being like, "Oh no, this is awesome."
Right.
Like,
but they thought it was plausible that maybe nobody would turn up, which is strange now to think about.
Right, because Ciclavia brings six figures out every time. 100,000, 150,000, 125,000, no matter whether it's the original route that connects East Hollywood area, which is literally a small community east of Hollywood, to Boyle Heights in East LA, or whether it's one of the spurs they had to the sea or on Wilshire Boulevard. It's packed, and it's packed to the point where we have to start putting out guidelines like, you know, be careful, don't go too fast, you're going to hit the kids. You know, almost like, because some people, there's such a latent demand for safe places to be outside and bicycle and do have fun and be on your streets and do different things, that whenever they hold these things, people just flock to them. And we've tried to, it's at the point now, you know, the first time they did this, we did like wall-to-wall coverage week to week. And I think it's a sign of how much the community has grown and how much we think about things differently in Los Angeles, and how much Ciclavia has become, like, from the Los Angeles phenomenon to just this awesome thing the city does every now and then. By the city, of course, I actually mean a nonprofit. But the city does help fund it a lot, and they do a lot of work. But there's a nonprofit, an amazing group of people that put this together every year. That now, like, before Ciclavia, they're like, what are we going to write about it? I don't know. I think I'm going to try walking the whole route and see if we don't know what to write, because how many times can you write, this is amazing? But that's how we feel almost every time. Like, it may not have that newness. Certainly no one has a sense of dread right beforehand that we are all sort of feeling the first time, but it's amazing. And it changed the way everybody that wasn't already thinking differently about our streets thought about our streets. The number of complaints that come in about Ciclavia is minuscule at this point. There was a lot of concern. The first time it ran, you know, LA Weekly ripped it before it happened. They referred to it as Mayor Villaraigosa's bike fantasy. Curbed. You know, the Architects, like, news website was sort of extremely skeptical of it. And you would think of them as being like the people that would be super on board.
What did they think was going to go wrong?
Well,
what did they think was poorly thought out about it?
I don't remember Curb's individual. I actually only remember the part about Curb because some Ciclavia people still mention it to me.
Oh, sure.
They were really, because that was what they read for news. I don't know why they weren't reading Streetsblog.
Right.
They were. But you know, that was, they were really sort of hurt by that one. LA Weekly at that point was, I mean, they're sort of, one of their niches is that they're extremely skeptical and confrontational with City Hall. And so, when Villaraigosa, months after he broke his elbow the first time he rode a bicycle in years, is like, we're going to do a big bike festival. Of course, they were like, I could see immediately, they're like, really? That was the best you could come up with, Antonio? But then the writer, this person who's basically a professional skeptic. I mean, he's not a bad writer. I don't mean to sound like I'm dissing him, but that's, I'm sure if he were to describe me, he would describe what he thinks of, as like the crazy bike person niche. Even though I think that's always weird because I don't really ride a bike that often. I walk a lot. I ride transit sometimes. I guess I bike. Anyway.
You're multimodal, like Los Angeles is becoming. You're a representative of that.
Oh, that's so sweet of you. But he actually, in the comment section afterwards, went, I was wrong, it was great. That was almost like the biggest compliment Ciclovia could get, that the person whose job it is to question and be skeptical of what comes out of City Hall actually said, no, this was amazing. And now LA Weekly runs its own contests for Ciclovia and scavenger hunts and things such as that. But that's part of what we're talking about, how we need to look at that event, which is a special event, not a day-to-day way to make the streets safer for bicycling and walking, but a special event, change the way people were talking about the city. That even the professional skeptics were like, oh no, this is cool.
And in some sense, the idea is to, as you say, there gets to be less and less to write about. The idea is for it to be something you wouldn't write about because it's so regular. Can you see it, a Ciclovia becoming a thing that's like Ciclovia? Is it every week, citywide, just an expectation, not a neat thing that happens periodically?
I think their goal is to get it to monthly. Mayor Eric Garcetti said he wants to get it to monthly and that he's going to put time into that. This year there's going to be 3. Last year there was 3. Before that there was 2. Before that there was 1. I think people thought there was going to be 4 this year. My guess is something fell through on one of the routes because there's a 6-month break between 2 of them, and then there's 2 and 3 months. So my guess is that something fell through over the summer. But again, that's speculation, such as how they built the train speculation from earlier. I've neither asked nor been told that. It's just speculation. But what's exciting about it is that they're never going to do what they did in Colombia, where they literally shut down all the major thoroughfares in downtown LA. They're not going to do that. But what they are doing is coming up with different routes. So there's going to be different ones every month when they do get that. There's going to be a route that's just South LA in the fall. Next year, they say there's going to be one that's just San Fernando Valley. And honestly, I'm really excited about the South LA one. We had a writer tasked to South LA for a little over 2 years now, and her writing in that area has really just opened my eyes and the eyes of a lot of people in the community to what's really going on there. Some of the stuff that's sort of the South LA stereotype, and some stuff that's really inspiring that you just wouldn't know about because the South LA press sort of doesn't write the same way she does, and mainstream press's coverage of South LA is depressing. The biggest bicycle club in South Los Angeles, the East Side Riders, public health-based group, get kids on bikes to fight obesity. They do charity events. The LA Register, our new daily newspaper in LA that is an arm of the Orange County Register, Long Beach Register, LA Register, like mini media empire, referred to them as a gang today.
Really?
A bicycle gang.
A gang.
And it's like, that's not a loaded term at all, right? But, especially for South Los Angeles, it's a bunch of, let's call them a bike gang. And I don't even know if that was intentional or not, but it's just like, I would imagine that a lot of people didn't bat an eye when they saw that. Well, it just looked really jarring to me. And I didn't read the article until it was sent to me by the same writer I mentioned, Sarah, our South LA writer, who just sort of said this, like, isn't this interesting? And I read it, and that immediately that's what jumped out at me. And it was the same thing that jumped out at her. I almost didn't get to the rest of the piece because it's just like, so I think a ride through South LA, a Ciclovia ride through South LA is going to be really interesting. It's going to open up a lot of people's eyes, I think, to what's really going on there. And what's going on there is you have a community that desperately wants to improve and change the way it is and the way it's viewed, and a lot of really exciting things going on. It's both a microcosm and an example. It's both a microcosm of what we were talking about in 2007, 2008, where we were sort of at the point before the turning point, but it's also, got, much deeper issues than us. You can build all the bike lanes you want, but if you're in gang territory, no one's riding their bike on them. Are you kidding? But you have groups that are, and I mean real gangs, not bike gangs.
Sure. Not quote unquote gangs, just gangs.
Yeah. So, I think it's going to be a really interesting ride. I hope a lot of people go on it. I hope it breaks all the Ciclovia records. I'm really excited about that one. And when I talk to the groups that have been in that area and have been fighting in that area to improve the conditions, the housing conditions, the public safety conditions, the transportation network conditions, all that, they're really excited about it too. And they're really proud of it. Cause it's going to be, they beat the Valley. They didn't beat the West Side. But again, we had a city council member lobbying pretty hard for it. But they're going to get it. And it's going to be, I just think and they've had a spur off of the traditional Ciclovia route that sort of goes into South LA. It goes down to the African American Firefighters Museum. But this one's like all the way through, and it's going to be great. And it's going to really, I think it's going to be sort of also a test of, how much power does Ciclovia has. I mean, it changed the conversation in LA. It changed the way people think about transportation. Can it do the same thing for a community that's not been given its due, for generations at this point? So it'll be interesting. South LA is not the South LA that was on fire in the 90s. And so how's that all going to shake out? And so it's going to be interesting and fun. Lots of fun. Everyone should go.
Exactly. And tell me, between when you arrived here in 2007 and now, what are some of the most important things you've learned about how to use Los Angeles, or how people use Los Angeles, or how to understand how people use Los Angeles? Any of those sort of degrees of the usage of this place? What has this place taught you about how to use it?
I don't know that there's sort of this is how to use Los Angeles guidebook that it makes sense for people. I mean, the city is so big geographically and so diverse, and there's so many micro communities and micro climates and micro everything that I think it's really hard to just say, this is Los Angeles.
Yes. That's a usage lesson right there, is there is no Los Angeles that is fixed.
Yeah, and I would argue that there's no Los Angeles that's broken, so to say. Like, people want to talk.
Oh, I see. That's an interesting way to use that word. I was thinking of fixed as in nailed down. Now fixed as it works both ways.
I was like, you're treading into bike gangs territory now. But
I guess they're both true. This both sense of fixed as in not broken and as in static.
And the image Los Angeles has given off to the world for years has been weird. And I think not representative of the larger community. And I think that's a result of having Hollywood here. Hollyweird,
sure.
As it's referred in some places. I think it's as a result, because there's so much media empire type stuff going on here. There's a lot of things that take place in Los Angeles in the television world. I remember the big critique of 24, in the world I lived in was, how do they get around LA that fast? I mean, they're in their car driving to Hollywood from their headquarters in downtown, and they get there during a commercial break. How do they do that?
Impossible.
Right, that's nuts. And it's like, that's the takeaway. And, I mentioned the Steve Martin movies where literally he's driving to pick up his mail at the end of the driveway and God talks to him through electronic freeway signs. I think the first thing to know is that those Los Angeleses don't exist.
Right. And probably never did.
Well, I've only been here 7 years. I suspect they never did, but I can't say they never did. Those Los Angeleses don't exist, but it's a big enough place that if you're just coming here, you can find a community that's going to fit both your wants and your needs as a community. And I think that might be a good place to start, but don't hunker down there and never leave. If you're, a progressive who loves bicycling and coffee shops and alternative music scenes, by all means, find a place in Echo Park, Silver Lake, and be absolutely happy there and love it. But don't, never go up to Highland Park, where there's a lot of great stuff happening and fun.
Where there's also coffee and music and cycling.
Oh, yeah. See, I always think of Highland Park as where the Bike Oven, the city's second storefront bike co-op, is, and I forget that it's becoming more of a hipster place, too. So forget I said Highland Park. Don't forget not to go to, Koreatown, too.
Yeah. Let's see. Don't forget to go to Little Armenia? I don't know. That's a good
idea. And, I make hipster jokes. I should note that while I'm wearing my Cubs hat today, I'm usually wearing a fedora and, designer jeans and a t-shirt that's maybe a little too tight. So it's self-deprecating when I use the term hipster. I actually just really like fedoras. They look nice with my hair. You can't casual me. But, I mean, there's just a huge cultural variety here. And it's more than Olvera Street, which is fun. I mean, don't get me wrong. Sure. It's more than the Hollywood Walk of Fame. There's these fun tourist places, and by all means visit them because they are fun. But you can
skip Universal City Walk though.
Yeah, I don't want to. They're building a bike path. I don't want to badmouth them. But
if you have to.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. But there's you can literally learn something new culturally about the world or about Los Angeles every day here for the rest of your life and just scratch the surface. There's so much going on. And even, you mentioned Mar Vista. I live on the west side. I live in Mar Vista, and people think of Mar Vista as like, your upper middle class white community, or maybe farther south, where you start to bump up against some of the even more rich communities, your upper class white community. And the school my kids are going to, there's no majority race. I mean, like the Los Angeles of, that's where the rich white people live. Maybe you can say that about Beverly Hills or maybe even Santa Monica, although I don't think that's true. Definitely not true what we've seen in Santa Monica. I don't know Beverly Hills' demographics, but like there is no like white enclave area in LA anymore. That's a good thing. And to flip that around, there's no, some people refer to it as gentrification. Some people refer to it as just growth. But, a lot of the Latino areas and African-American areas are becoming mixed race too. And that's part of the LA story, for better and for worse. I certainly understand why people would be frustrated if they've been fighting to improve a community for generations and all of a sudden they can't afford to live in it just when it starts to become a livable community. And the flip of that is I think LA is becoming what people like to pretend America is, which is becoming a real melting pot where everyone just sort of gets along. And that's great.
I've been speaking here in Mar Vista, Los Angeles, with Damien Newton, the editor of Streetsblog Los Angeles, which is what you should be reading and what I do as well, due to my interest and due to the interest you no doubt have, if you heard this whole thing, in sustainable transportation and livable communities. I've also, by the way, been hearing from his young daughter, who's now fast asleep. Damien, thanks so much.
No, thank you. You must have a very soothing voice that she went from cranky baby to sleeping baby during the course of an interview.
But there you have it. Once again, this has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with all the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.